When I was in my early 20s, I got very sick. And the whole story belongs in a different sermon, but the bottom line is that years of intense anxiety, perfectionism, and a grinding terror of not enoughness had finally become too much for my body and my mind. And so I found myself in a therapist's office facing the daunting task of not living like this anymore. And one of the things this incredible therapist did was walk me through a simple mindfulness meditation exercise. These are known to be really helpful for people with the kind of stuff going on that I have, and also for everybody else. So I just want to plug the Saturday meditation classes that Mary Dillard is running. But before I even finished the exercise, as I'm sitting there being walked through this, I was already thinking, okay, this is what I have to do, and working out how I'd start getting that done to the utmost perfection. And as soon as I left her office, I went to a bookstore, and I bought some books on mindfulness, and I got a notebook, and I made a schedule, and a calendar, and a checklist for my daily meditation practice. I downloaded apps on my phone. I set timers and digital calendars to make sure I did it every day. I even set up a little meditation spot in my room after doing research online about the correct seating position. I had an assignment, and I was going to ace it. I was going to meditate so much, and so hard, and so fast, and so good. When it came to getting better, I was going to be the best. So you can imagine my frustration when the following week I shared all of this with my therapist, and she was not impressed. I did not get an A in therapy. Instead, she leaned forward and she told me with the gentle exasperation that this was not the point, that I didn't need these rigid schedules and high standards to reap the benefits of meditation. She told me the ability to find peace in the present moment did not come from checked off lists and organized schedules. She told me it goes with you wherever your breath goes. At the time, this seemed very unhelpful, because that's everywhere, so what am I supposed to do with that? But I'm here today, so she eventually got through to me. And this story, this experience that I had in the early days of therapy, came back as I looked at the scriptures for today's lectionary, which is the first Sunday in Lent. There we go. So what do we do in Lent, right? We're beginning our 40 days of penitence, contemplation, and discipline in preparation for Easter. But even with this in mind, the biblical passages from today don't actually focus on anything we are supposed to do. In the Old Testament, we're already past Noah and that hard work building and then tending to the ark. Instead, we hear God promising to remember and hold to a covenant of life-giving presence. In the epistle, we reflect on what Jesus did for us and the graceful, loving, divine presence that our baptism continues to cover us in. And then in the gospel, we have the story of Jesus' baptism and of God's presence descending to declare, "You are my Son, the beloved. With you I am well pleased." God's covenant, God's promise, God's grace, God's love. Today, the scriptures echo with the reality that this all goes with us wherever our breath goes. And today's scriptures use baptism, our baptism, Christ's baptism, and the baptism of the earth under floodwaters, as a reminder of this divine presence that we carry with us as closely and as constantly as the breath in our lungs. Our Lenten book this season is called The Lives We Actually Have, and it has an accompanying devotional called Bless the Lent We Actually Have. And I really encourage everyone to get it and check it out and read it, but it is nice that the central thesis is right there in the title. Like a meditation practice that is always available and accessible by tuning into the breath I'm actually breathing, Lent is not about making some new and separate space in our lives for God to enter into. It's about recognizing and honoring the presence of God in the lives and the bodies and the rhythms that we are already living. And as cool as our Lenten book is, there's another book on this topic that I really like. It's called Liturgy of the Ordinary by Tish Warren. And in this book, she connects the sacred, sacramental elements of our liturgy and everything we do here to the mundane daily routines of our lives. So checking email is blessing and sending, talking to her spouse is passing the peace. But she starts the book with waking up, which she corresponds to remembering our baptism as we enter a church and dip our fingers in the font. And she references the very story that we read in the gospel today, and she writes, "It is remarkable that when the Father declares at Jesus' baptism, 'This is my beloved Son, with whom I am well pleased,' Jesus hasn't yet done much of anything that anyone would find impressive. He hasn't yet healed anyone or resisted Satan in the wilderness. He hasn't yet been crucified or resurrected. It would make more sense if the Father's proud announcement came after something grand and glorious, the triumphant moment after feeding a multitude, or the big reveal after Lazarus is raised. But the one who is worthy of worship, glory, and fanfare spent decades in obscurity and ordinariness. As if the incarnation itself is not mind-bending enough, the incarnate God spent his days quietly, a man who went to work, got sleepy, and lived a pedestrian life among average people. Jesus emerges from the water a commoner, wet and messy-haired. And suddenly the Spirit of God shows up and the deep mystery of the universe reverberates through the air. This is the Son of God, the Son the Father loves, in whom he is well pleased." Jesus is sent first to the desert and then into his public ministry, but he is sent out with a declaration of the Father's love. Jesus is eternally beloved by the Father. His every activity unfurls from this identity as the beloved. He loved others, healed others, preached, taught, rebuked, and redeemed, not in order to gain the Father's approval, but out of his rooted certainty in the Father's love. Now, our scripture today does also include Jesus going out into the wilderness, just as we are invited into the 40 days of Lent in our own ways. And I want to be clear that what I'm saying in today's sermon is not that Lent is pointless or that we shouldn't and don't need to do anything to observe these holy days, because it doesn't matter. When I was sick, I needed to do work to get better. I needed to go to therapy and then actually listen. I needed to try and find ways to reorient myself toward healthier ways of being. I'll tell you, it was not easy. It took the same kind of changes and discipline as our Lenten journey. But what I did not need to do was use rubrics and rigid requirements to conjure my own enoughness. I was not solely responsible for making myself well. I couldn't just white-knuckle my way through recovery by doing everything perfectly and driving myself forward with the same strategies that had gotten me there in the first place. My work, instead, was surrendering to the care that I needed and shifting my perspective to accept the truths that were already there, but which I hadn't been able to see. My work was to try new things, to live in a different way, not because that was another task to succeed at, but because that's what it would take to live a healthy life. And at times it felt really hard. Lent is not easy. Getting better was not easy. At times it seemed impossible, but I'll tell you, the alternative was not an option. There is work for us to do, big work, hard work, important work, because recognizing and living into God's loving presence is a big deal. We don't do hard things for Lent to impress God or ourselves or each other. We don't do it to get an A in Lent, as cool as that would be. We do hard things for Lent because it's important. It's necessary. The alternative, living in oblivion to or rejection of God's loving presence, is, like staying sick, a whole lot worse. So I've cited some Christian intellectuals. I also saw an Instagram post this week that I'm going to cite. It says this: "We are image bearers with work to do, not workers with an image to maintain." We are image bearers with work to do, not workers with an image to maintain. That's what Lent is all about. So whatever you choose as your Lenten discipline, whether it's daily time with our super cool devotional, or some kind of self-denial or new habit, do it as the work of an image bearer, not as a worker maintaining an image. Now, with a brain like mine, I do have to be careful about Lent, but I love Lent. I think it can be really transformational to engage in a Lenten discipline, but for the reasons we hear in today's scripture. The way we enter the water of a baptism, the way we remember a covenant with God. Like Christ's ministry, our Lenten disciplines are made possible by God's loving presence, not a prerequisite for it deigning to descend to us. Who here was at Ash Wednesday? Love Ash Wednesday. Yeah. Ash Wednesday services were less than an hour long. Matt would have been proud. But within that hour-long service, I counted at least 7 instances where we either thank God for welcoming us into the holiness of Lent or ask God to make us Lenten people, to help change our hearts and keep us on our Lenten journey. We don't promise God that if God just gets back to us in 40 days, we'll have it all together. We ask God, be with us as we do this work. We participate in Lent alongside God, as people invited onto its paths, strengthened in our holy work by a God who loves us and who shares that work with us, empowering us to succeed in drawing closer to God's love. Our Lenten practices, like baptism and like meditation with your breath, orient us towards something that is already there, waiting for us to attune to it. We set our hearts to the work of Lent not because we must earn our way into belovedness by checking the right boxes and doing hard enough things, but because we are responding to a belovedness that is already present with us wherever